I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we are back on the Zero Hour, broadcasting from Netroots Nation. And with us now is Stephanie Kelton. Stephanie is the chair of the Department of Economics at the University of Missouri in Kansas City, and she is also one of the leading experts in this country on modern monetary theory, among other things. She also is one of the principal authors, maybe the editor, I don't know, of the new Economic Perspectives blog, which I read regularly. And if you're interested in the kind of stuff I write about, you probably should too. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So listen, I've seen you. We're here on Radio Row at Netroots Nation, and I've seen you making the rounds of interviews. I'm interested to know what in general is on your mind to talk about. But you know, we talk a lot on this show about inequality and about what to do about inequality and about some of the prevailing economic trends. We've had Rob Johnson on, who runs the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and I know you've done some work with Rob and INET talking about the sort of misguided ideas sometimes that seep into our economic conversation. But I am interested. I've never had anybody on this show talking about modern monetary theory. And, you know, I have a little grounding in economics. I've written on it. I've run projects in it, but mostly healthcare. But I don't have a deep theoretical background. So, you know, what comes to my mind when MMT, as it's abbreviated, I mean, two things come to mind. One is the Cross of Gold speech by William Jennings Bryan, and bimetallism, the idea that we wouldn't tether ourselves.
Right.
And this seems to me a sort of non-metalism, a sort of, and the other is Adam Smith's quote about money being a construct, a collectively agreed upon artificial construct. And I think, but you'll tell me how I'm wrong, where, when, and how I'm wrong. My understanding is that modern monetary theory basically says that governments create currency by fiat, or money by fiat. It's not tied to a physical object like gold anymore, and therefore we should recognize that. Is that the general idea, and make policy accordingly?
Yeah, I think that's very well said. I mean, so many of the textbooks that were written, Samuelson's textbook, right? All the way after the publication of the general theory. And you get this branch of economics that becomes macroeconomics, right, as distinct from just political economy or economics more generally. And these textbooks just sort of get repackaged year after year. We change the covers. We don't change the content a whole lot, right, a little bit. But for the most part, the economics that we teach today looks very much like the economics that we taught in the 60s when the monetary system was completely different. And so what we try to do is emphasize that we had this fundamental change in the way the monetary system is set up, and that is, Richard Nixon took the U.S. off the gold standard. And so in 1971, the system went under a complete overhaul, and the textbooks never made the same transition. So we tell the same stories as if the government faces the same constraints. In the 60s, you got the government budget constraint stuff, and now we have the idea that governments are just like great big households, and they have to behave like a household, balance their budget, live within their means, all that kind of stuff. And so, one of the big contributions I think we've made is in helping people think more clearly about the way the monetary system works and the way government finance works.
And to me, this confusion, it's across the political spectrum. It drives me crazy to hear both Republicans and President Obama, for example, use this kitchen table, or we've got to tighten our belts, we've got to go. It will, just like any American family does, and I always want to say, just like any American family which issues the dominant global currency. Is that your family? Is that mine? So, and just like, and by the way, when it comes up in the context of cutting Social Security, just like any American family wouldn't talk about starving grandma to pay for Junior's Maserati, there's that dimension of it too. But I guess then you have. I'm so glad you mentioned the Nixon taking us off the gold standard, because to me that seems like a pivotal event that people just kind of ignore. But what are the implications of this in terms of actual policy making? I mean, can you take it to the extreme of saying we don't need to worry about deficit spending anymore at all, or where does this logic lead us?
Okay, so the logic leads you, if you recognize that you're not on a gold standard, that in order to buy things, you don't have to go out and dig up a shiny rock from the ground in order to pay for something, that that the United States government, and you said issues the currency. So if the US dollar comes from the US government and can't come from anywhere else, it doesn't come from China, then at least we dispense with all of those excuses that we hear when we talk about the sorts of policies and programs that we would like to see in place, and our politicians say, well, we'd like that too, but we can't afford it. How are you going to pay for it? There's no money. So the first step is recognizing that the affordability question should be off the table. The next question is, once you recognize that you have the ability to buy things, the US government could technically afford to buy anything that's for sale in US dollars, domestically or internationally. And they can outbid anyone, right? There's no one that can outbid the government in terms of US dollars, not the Koch brothers, not anybody. So the question is, what are the constraints? And does the deficit ever matter? And I would say, and we always say, yes, of course it matters, okay? But it matters in a way that most people don't usually think about. The constraint is on the inflation side. So if the government said, look, I issue the currency, dollars can't come from anywhere else, I have a monopoly. If you try to create them, it's counterfeit. You go to jail. So the dollars can only come from me. Now, because I issue the currency, I'm going to go out and spend on everything. I'm going to buy up everything. Well, that's going to be very inflationary. But in a depressed economy, when you've got millions of people who can't find work but want to work, and you've got factories operating at, 2/3 or 3/4 of their full capacity, and you've got raw materials lying around available, you can spend into that economy and mobilize resources and put people to work and do things that are important, like infrastructure and healthcare and education. You can climate, right? You can solve and address real problems if you have the real resources available to do it. But we're so hung up on how are we going to pay for it all, and can we do it in a balanced budget environment, right? Is it revenue neutral? That we end up getting nothing done.
Well, quick historical aside, in the 19th century, of course, other people were producing alternate scripts, banks and so on, but we weren't connected with telecommunications the way we are. So the government is the only one who can issue dollars. What you're describing sounds to me a little bit like Keynesianism on steroids, basically saying that we have the ability to use stimulus-type interventions, Keynesian-type interventions, plus much more, because we now have a flexibility in terms of currency issuance that we didn't have before. Is that the right way to read what you're saying?
Well, Keynes did say that. I mean, it's not even so much Keynes on steroids. Once Keynes got to this point, and he got there working with Abel Lerner and reading the work of Abel Lerner, who wrote and called his approach functional finance. And he said, look, what we're doing is basically dysfunctional finance. All this sound finance stuff, balancing the budget is the top priority and all that. And Lerner said we ought to be running policy according to functional finance. And so
that was even before Nixon took us off the gold standard.
Yeah, this was in the 40s.
Right.
Yeah. And
so there's more flexibility now.
That's right. But so now even more flexibility. So you just see
part, by the way.
Right. Okay. Right. Got it.
Okay.
So the policy space opens up when you have the type of monetary system we have. There's more room to maneuver, but we're not willing to use all the space that we have because we're too worried about turning into Greece, the Chinese punishing us, the bond vigilantes coming, burdening the next generation with bonds, right, that we pass down to them that they call, my inheritance. And so we're just getting so much so wrong that it paralyzes us.
So this gets to the $1 trillion question, which is, which I know some of your contributors to New Economic Perspectives feel strongly about, which is the platinum coin that was discussed a great deal last year. The idea that if Congress refuses or there's any other political gridlock, that the president can mint $1 trillion platinum. Now, Paul Krugman and other people signed on to this idea. It's not exclusive to the modern monetary theory adherents necessarily, but the idea the president could theoretically mint $1 trillion coin and use that to pay for projects that he needs. True or false?
False.
Okay.
Okay, so a couple of things. It's close, but it's the Treasury Secretary who legally would have the authority to strike a platinum coin of any denomination. I mean, he could call it $500 billion, $60 trillion, $100 trillion, whatever he wanted, or she, maybe one day, to stamp on that coin and take it over to their bank, which is the Fed, and say, I'm here to make a deposit, so let's call it $100 trillion just for fun.
Right.
So I'm dropping my $100 trillion proof platinum coin into my account. Please credit my account. Now, the Fed has to do that. Okay, I think enough legal scholars, Yale scholars, law professors, and so forth wrote about this, and the legality, I think, anyway, is pretty clear. The Fed has to do this. and Congress is the boss of the Fed. So let's say the Fed credits the bank account. Now, the U.S. Treasury has an account with an extra $100 trillion in it. What happens? Nothing. There's no more spending into the economy. There's no inflation. It's just, they just have more numbers, right?
But now, they could then spend it, right?
If Congress, but then you have to get to the point, right, where Congress has to approve, set a budget and allocate and appropriate and all that stuff. And then you get the spending, and then you debit the account, just like when you and I spend from our checking account. The numbers will go down over time, but only as much as Congress allows, right, the government to spend on infrastructure, education, healthcare, whatever it is. So it would be, I guess, a slick and clever way. I've never written about the coin myself. I did some television appearances on it, but yeah, it was a little bit of a hot topic for a while, and it's a slick way to at least cut at the knees those who say we can't afford it, we can't afford it. So there's the money. Now tell me whether we have approval to spend it.
Now, just hypothetically, if they spent half, $50 trillion, based off more than they planned to, if there was another $100 trillion in circulation, what would that do to the dollar?
Oh, well, I mean, it depends how much you're spending.
Right, if you spend all of it, let's say.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that question, but it would probably be quite bad if you were to spend $50 trillion very rapidly into the economy. That would be, and without taxing a significant amount back out. I mean, that's the difference, right? So you have to. The dollar's going to have value as long as people are willing and in some cases required to work and produce and sell things in order to get dollars, because they've got to pay taxes. So when you see countries that have currencies that blow up, nobody wants to hold the dollar or hold the currency. It begins to lose value. Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, whatever. It usually is associated with a regime collapse, with war, civil war, Confederate currency, right? After the war.
People still seem to trust the dollar, though.
Yes, people trust the dollar. And Adam Smith also wrote in The Wealth of Nations about the fact that the prince, by virtue of the fact that he demands that his taxes be paid in some specific currency that he issues, gives value to that currency. And so as long as you have the right to make and enforce your tax laws, your currency is going to have value. You'd have to do something pretty destructive, right? In an otherwise well-functioning
and we have a pretty huge economy and a lot of people. And, all right, last question, but it's a big one. So what do we do to change this? I feel as if we need anthropologists to come in and study the economics community and understand why the folkways have persisted. So why some of them are so persistent in the face of contradictory data. We saw it especially after the 2008 crisis, that there's still people are still clinging to old beliefs about the way the market works, about the wisdom of the market, about and of course with monetary theory argument about it's a different world than it used to be. What can be done to change the shared beliefs that aren't necessarily objectively grounded in the economics community?
Well, I think that what you do and what I'm trying to do and many others is working. I mean, I see movement. It's not as much movement or as rapid as I wish it were in my own discipline, but there are voices that are more powerful than others, and some people have a huge following, and to the extent that those folks and Paul Krugmans and people like that begin to get the stuff right and help people see beyond Margaret Thatcher, that there is no alternative. Well, if you think there's no alternative, you don't ask for anything. You start buying into that idea that we have to have shared sacrifice. And when the government says we've got no alternative but to cut, otherwise we're burdening our next generation and we're destroying the country, you say, oh my God, it's my patriotic duty to take these cuts, right? So I hope that my efforts and yours and others are helping people to reach the point where they can start connecting the dots. There was $29 trillion for Wall Street conjured up out of thin air after the crisis. How come there's never money, for infrastructure or climate or education or any of the stuff that we want? So we just have to empower people to push back against this, I think.
Good answer. All right. Thank you so much for joining us.
You.
Stephanie Kelton, Chair of Economics at the University of Missouri in Kansas City.
That's right. Thank you.
Thank you. This is the 0 Hour. I'm RJ Eskow. We'll be right back.